Hello, I'm Samira Fatima. I'll be teaching you environmental law, and your first unit is international environmental law. So let's start from that. So to understand this subject, we need to understand about the core of this subject, that is the term environment. So what is environment, where it is defined? So under Indian legislation, there is this legislation, Environmental Protection Act 1986, and under section 2, it is defined. So what is environment? So environment includes water, land, and air and their interrelationship between every human beings, living creatures, plants, microorganism, and property. So in simple terms, we can say that environment is everything which we see in our surrounding, whether living or non-living, or which has direct or indirect contact with water, air, and land. So now after environment, we need to understand about its pollutants, the pollutants which are responsible for damaging the environment. So these pollutants can be in the form of liquid, gas, or solid, which tend to harm the environment. So anything which is in the form of liquid, gas, or solid which has the property of polluting the environment is termed as environmental pollutants. And the last definition is the hazardous substance. So what is a hazardous substance? So any substance which has the property or which is likely to cause harm to any living creatures, including humans, plants, microorganism property, and overall the environment. The term international environmental law, in short we can say IEL, itself suggests that these are those environmental laws which are global in nature. So what is IEL? IEL is an attempt to regulate the following. और क्या क्या है इसके अंदर? Population, biodiversity, climate change, ozone depletion, and poisonous and hazardous substance. So these five things are generally covered under international environmental law. So under this unit, we will be talking about those conferences, agreements, summit which covers these things. To have a better understanding, I have included these two images. First is biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? It is the presence of all kind of life on earth. जितने भी living creatures हैं, including plants, animals, microorganisms, humans, all these together comprises a biodiversity. Now what is ozone depletion? Why I'm explaining these two things? क्योंकि अभी आगे ये दोनों words बहुत आएंगे पूरे environmental law में. तो अब ozone depletion समझने के लिए we have to understand what is ozone layer. So our Earth's atmosphere is having this ozone layer which protects us from solar radiation. जितने भी harmful sun के raises होते हैं उससे ये protect करता है. But due to the pollution that we are having, the release of carbon dioxide, then CFCs, there are सेवरल होल्स इन दी ओजोन लेयर. तो अब क्या हो रहा है, जो एक प्रोटेक्शन का एक लेयर था हम लोगों के पास ओजोन लेयर, अब वो धीरे धीरे डिप्लीट हो रहा है, रिड्यूस हो रहा है, कम होते जा रहा है, एंड बिकॉज ऑफ विच वी आर फेसिंग हार्श रेडिएशन फ्रॉम द सन. To understand about the roots or traces of international environmental law, we have to look at the three sources of international environmental law. So the first one is the very common one, that is international treaties. The treaties signed by the countries agreeing upon certain decisions. This is mostly related to environmental laws. Second is your customary international law. So the general practice of the nations has become the international law governing the environment. Third one is any matter which comes to the international courts relating to the environment, those decisions become the source of international environmental law. I hope basics are clear. Now coming to the most important part, that is the previous year question. So इस unit से एक ये question आया था which appears very tough and tricky, but actually it is asking about the evolution. So it is asking you to comment how international environmental conferences from Stockholm, which is the starting point of environmental conferences, till Rio plus 20 has contributed to global environmental governance in achieving development, climate change and biodiversity protection. तो इसके अंदर हम लोग क्या बात करेंगे? We will just explain about the evolution of international environmental laws. जैसे ही वो evolution हम लोग complete करेंगे, we will cover all these स्टॉकहोम से लेके रियो प्लस एजेंडा 2030. So in next few slides I'll be talking about this particular question, that is the evolution of international environmental laws. So to understand this we have to go back to 1900s. बट अगर देखा जाए तो सबसे ज़्यादा डेवलपमेंट लास्ट 5 डेकेड्स में हुआ है, दैट इज़ 50 years बैक we did something that has proven so important for our environment. तो इसका एक टाइमलाइन बना हुआ है. So we will cover this topic in 3 timelines, so it will become easier. First is your 1900s to 1972, then 1972 to 1992, and then 1992 till date. So this is the 3 time period that we will study so we can understand this topic better. So this is the timeline which I have mentioned. Look at the last paragraph. The evolution of international environmental law can be separated into 3 distinct periods. First is 1900 to 1972, then from 1972 to 1992, and then from 1992 to present. During 1900s to 1972, there were not many conferences held or agreement or treaties signed, but there was this common and popular belief that God has given the earth to his people and it is their responsibility to protect it and preserve it and pass down to their next generation. Because of this, many popular practices were developed, like not cutting down the trees, not polluting the water, protecting the fishing. So because of this, in 1930s and 1940s, we saw that several agreements were signed to protect the flora and fauna, mostly in the African continent. Then in 1950s, what we saw that people fought for marine pollution which were caused by oil or the nuclear energy and negotiated several agreements to protect their water and to protect their earth. Now comes the period of 1972 and 1992. ये सबसे important period माना जाता है in the history of international environmental law. क्यों? Because this was the starting point where majority of the countries came together to discuss about environmental problems. लेकिन सबसे बड़ा focus क्या था इस conference का जो 1972 में हुआ था, which is known as UN Stockholm Declaration on the ह्यूमन एनवायरनमेंट. इसको शॉर्ट में हम लोग स्टॉकहोम डिक्लेरेशन 1972 भी बोलते हैं. तो इसमें सबसे मेजर प्रॉब्लम जो डिस्कस हुआ था वो था इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट एंड एनवायरमेंटल प्रोटेक्शन. सो द कंट्रीज वर इन द डिलेमा हाउ टू डेवलप इकोनॉमिकली एंड टू प्रोटेक्ट एनवायरमेंट एट द सेम टाइम. And this conference is very important because it marked the beginning of several other conferences and agreements of environment. So after the Stockholm conferences, these are the developments that took place, and it is also called as a origin point of international environmental law. तो सबसे पहले क्या हुआ था? It gave birth to United Nations Environmental Program, that is UNEP. उसके बाद UNESCO आया, then your CITES, which talks about the international trade of endangered species of wild fauna and flora. तो जितने भी ट्रेडिंग होती थी स्पीशीज की, फ्लोरा एंड फाउना की, जो एंडेंजर्ड था उसके ऊपर भी काफी रेस्ट्रिक्शंस, पेनल्टी, लाइबिलिटीज इंक्लूड हो गए आफ्टर दिस कन्वेंशन. नाउ कंट्रीज वर टॉकिंग अबाउट इट. वियना कन्वेंशन 1985, इसमें पहली बार बात हुई थी ओजोन लेयर के बारे में. व्हेन कंट्रीज केम टुगेदर एंड टॉक्ड अबाउट द सीरियस नेचर ऑफ ओजोन लेयर, द डिप्लीशन दैट वाज हैपनिंग ड्यू टू द पोल्यूशन. देन वर्ल्ड चार्टर फॉर नेचर 1982. तो इस चार्टर के बाद क्या हुआ था? वी गॉट 5 मेजर प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ एनवायरनमेंट दैट एवरी कंट्री शुड अबाइड और शुड फॉलो. देन लास्ट वन इज योर मॉन्ट्रियल प्रोटोकॉल फॉर द प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ ओजोन लेयर 1987. तो पहले वियना में बात हुई थी ओजोन लेयर के बारे में, फिर मॉन्ट्रियल प्रोटोकॉल में ओजोन लेयर के बारे में बात हुई कि दैट वी शुड डू समथिंग टू प्रोटेक्ट आवर ओजोन लेयर विच इज प्रोटेक्टिंग अस फ्रॉम द हार्मफुल सन. ये सारी चीजें आगे के स्लाइड्स में भी मेंशन्ड है एंड अच्छे से एक्सप्लेन्ड है. आई एम जस्ट कीपिंग इट ब्रीफ सो यू कैन राइट दिस in your exam if the question comes about the evolution. Now comes the last period, that is 1992 till present. So in 1992 UN had its conference in Rio on development and environment. Why this conference is known as Rio? Because it was held in Rio, Brazil. And why that conference known as Stockholm? Because it held in Sweden, Stockholm. So 1992 marked a very historic point for international environmental law. Why? Because of this, we are having many conventions, particularly about climate change and how to manage environment and development together. So the first one was United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In short, it is also known as UNFCCC. So this was in 1992, happened after the Rio conference. So what happened under this convention? This convention particularly talked about how to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system, like stabilizing greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere. So under this, in 1992 we were first time talking about climate change. अब climate change क्या होता है? जैसे अभी हम लोग विटनेस कर रहे हैं 2024 में, sudden heat, sudden rain, harsh winters. So these are all climate change. तो हम लोगों की body या जो surrounding है, जो environment है, these things are not prepared for these sudden changes, because of which the majority of the species are suffering. So next in 1997 happened Kyoto Protocol. तो Kyoto Protocol में क्या हुआ था? ये बेसिकली एक एक्सटेंडेड वर्क था UNFCCC का, जिसमें बात हुई थी कैसे रिड्यूस करना है ग्रीन हाउस गैसेस को जो ग्लोबल वार्मिंग कॉज कर रहा है. So UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol both talked about one thing which is very important, that is climate change. To answer the question of environment and development, the Rio Earth Summit 1992, which is also known as Agenda 21, provided the answer. That was the sustainable development. Now, what is sustainable development? It means that to use the environment appropriately and in such a manner that we would leave it for the future generation without harming it. So to help with the sustainable development concept, again the Johannesburg conference in 2002 was held, and its main agenda was to make the sustainable development concept more popular and to help the pace of Agenda 21 implementation. Now comes the Rio Plus 20 Model Nations Conference on Sustainable Development 2012. It is also known as Earth Summit 2012 or Rio 2012 or Rio Plus 20. So the main topic or the agenda of this conference was similar to Rio Earth Summit and Johannesburg conferences. That is the sustainable development. ये सारे conferences बात कर रहे हैं sustainable development के ऊपर. This is what happened after 1992. और लास्ट वाला क्या है? Paris Agreement, which happened in 2015, and it is also known as Paris Climate Accords or Paris Accords. और इसमें क्या बात हुई थी? इसमें बात हुई थी हम लोगों का क्लाइमेट चेंज के ऊपर, उसका मिटिगेशन, अडेप्टेशन एंड फिनेंस के ऊपर. So under 1992 we have discussed majorly about environment and development, and the answer is sustainable development, and also about climate change.